What if the darkness you fear most is not outside you but within? Not evil in others, but the unknown in yourself. Carl Jung believed that our greatest moral challenge is not to judge the world, but to face the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. The shadow is not a mood. It is not just trauma. It is a moral reality. It holds the parts of your psyche that contradict your identity, the parts you find unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. And because they are hidden, they shape you in silence. You think you are acting from reason, from virtue, from goodness, but often you are acting from avoidance, from denial, from fear of what you cannot bear to admit. And that fear has consequences, not just psychological ones, ethical ones. To Jung, the shadow is a moral problem because it tempts us to lie. Not to others, but to ourselves. We lie about our intentions. We lie about our anger. We lie about the pleasure we feel when we secretly judge. These lies form the roots of projection. The more righteous you feel, the more likely your shadow is in control. Because morality without self-awareness becomes blindness. You think you are saving others, but really you are avoiding yourself, and what is avoided always returns. There is a reason shadow work is so difficult. It threatens your story of being a good person. It humbles the ego. It whispers the unthinkable, that you are not who you appear to be. And yet, this confrontation is where integrity begins. Carl Jung did not treat the psyche as a machine to be fixed. He treated it as a moral terrain to be navigated. And at the center of that terrain stands the shadow. Not simply as a wound, but as a crisis of conscience. The shadow confronts not just the conscious mind, but the ethical self. It challenges who you think you are and what you believe yourself to be. It does not simply disturb your thoughts. It questions your integrity. It holds up a mirror to your character. Jung saw that morality without shadow becomes dangerous. Because when people try to be good without being whole, they push their contradictions underground. They appear clean on the outside, but their repressed impulses do not vanish. They return through control, cruelty, and projection. You may suppress your envy, but it returns as subtle sabotage. You may deny your anger, but it seeps through sarcasm, judgment, or passive withdrawal. The more you try to be pure, the more your shadow finds unconscious ways to leak through. The conscience is not the same as guilt. Guilt may be inherited, misplaced, or neurotic, but conscience is your soul's compass. And when the shadow rises, it tests whether your moral voice is real or just rehearsed. It asks whether you can face yourself without collapsing. To Jung, facing the shadow was not just therapy. It was ethical work, the work of becoming inwardly honest, of no longer pretending, of standing before the darker aspects of your being and saying, I will not look away. I will not deceive myself further. The moment you suppress the shadow, you begin to lose sight of truth. Not because you intend to lie, but because your perception bends around what you refuse to see. Your mind filters reality to protect your image, and your conscience slowly grows numb. You may still feel moral. You may still follow rules, speak kindly, help others. But if it is all in service of avoiding your inner conflict, it becomes performance. Goodness without inner truth becomes a disguise, and the person wearing it begins to forget who they are. This is how ethical blindness forms. You become more invested in appearing righteous than in being real. You judge others with increasing certainty, but you rarely pause to ask why they bother you, because the question would reveal too much. Jung warned that the shadow does not disappear when ignored. It grows stronger. It becomes sharper, darker, more clever, and it begins to act through you. It borrows your voice. It wears your principles. It speaks the language of virtue while fueling quiet harm. Entire groups, movements, even nations can fall into this blindness. They see evil on the outside. They fight monsters they do not recognize in themselves. They become convinced that their violence is justified because their cause is pure. But purity that denies the shadow always leads to cruelty, because it no longer has empathy. It no longer questions itself. It no longer knows how to see humanity in those it condemns. And it no longer sees the shadow in its own reflection. This is the danger Jung saw so clearly, that when morality becomes disconnected from inner integration, it becomes ideology. And ideology without shadow becomes a tool of unconscious destruction, one that believes it is saving the world. Carl Jung believed that evil does not begin in hatred. It begins in unconsciousness, not in the actions of monsters, but in the refusal of ordinary people to face the darkness within themselves. This refusal, multiplied across a group, becomes the collective shadow. The collective shadow forms when a society projects all that it fears, rejects, or cannot control onto outsiders, onto races, religions, ideologies, classes, or enemies. It becomes convinced that the evil is not in us, but always in them. This is the birth of moral violence, where cruelty is justified by righteousness, where war is waged not in the name of conquest, but of cleansing, where the shadow becomes so disowned that it must be destroyed wherever it is seen. Jung lived through the rise of Nazism. He saw how entire nations could become possessed by shadow, not by accident, but by denial. Denial of their own capacity for control, vengeance, superiority, and fear. That denial gave rise to horror. He warned that what we do not face in ourselves, we will enact through others. That the more virtuous we pretend to be, the more our unconscious seeks an outlet for the repressed. If it cannot come through healing, it will come through destruction. Even today, the collective shadow moves through culture. In polarization, in scapegoating, in moral absolutism, in the inability to imagine that the evil we condemn might live inside the very story we believe is good. Jung did not excuse evil. He illuminated its root. And he showed that the only antidote to collective destruction is individual integration. One person at a time becoming honest, awake, capable of carrying their own darkness with responsibility. Most people do not fear being bad. They fear appearing bad. They fear rejection, shame, judgment, so they build a mask, a persona made of kindness, humility, virtue, and they convince themselves that it is who they really are. Carl Jung called this the danger of identification with the persona. When you believe the mask is the whole self, you begin to split. You suppress anything that contradicts your image. You exile anger, envy, lust, ambition, fear. But what is suppressed is not erased. The more tightly you cling to being good, the more violently you reject anything that feels otherwise. And when those forbidden traits appear in others, you react. Not with awareness, but with projection. Not with curiosity, but with blame. The tragedy is that the good person persona often begins with sincerity. You want to be loving, you want to help, you want to do right. But without shadow work, goodness becomes armor. And that armor can turn rigid, cold, even cruel. You may become someone who cannot hear feedback, who silences others with virtue, who judges in the name of righteousness, who avoids truth because it might crack the mask. And so the persona becomes a prison, one you built to stay safe. True character is not found in the persona. It is found in the space behind it, in the courage to admit contradiction, in the humility to hold both your light and your darkness without collapsing into shame or superiority. Jung saw that the brighter the persona, the darker the shadow. The more you need others to see you as good, the more you fear the truth inside. And so, the work is not to destroy the persona, but to loosen your grip, to return to what is real. The more you polish your public image, the more the unseen parts of you begin to rot. Carl Jung warned that light without depth becomes blindness. When you over-identify with your goodness, your darkness grows hungry. It waits in silence, looking for a way out. People who try hardest to appear pure often carry the deepest unconscious shadow. The preacher obsessed with sin, the activist driven by rage, the healer who cannot admit their own pain. These are not rare exceptions. They are patterns of repression. The more you deny your darkness, the more it finds expression through extremes, through projection, through moral superiority, through punishing others for the very traits you have not dared to name in yourself. Jung saw this not as hypocrisy, but as tragedy. The tragedy of a soul that wants to be whole but believes it must be perfect. A soul that longs for integration but chooses denial. And in that denial, it becomes dangerous. Because when the persona becomes too bright, the shadow must become darker to balance it. It sharpens, it deepens, it begins to sabotage from the inside. And often, the person has no idea. They believe their virtue is pure, but the energy behind it has turned toxic. You may speak of peace while secretly resenting everyone who disagrees with you. You may preach love while secretly craving control. You may fight injustice while projecting your rage onto strangers, and you will not see it. Because the mask is blinding. To Jung, the only solution was shadow work. The deliberate turning inward. The choice to see the parts of you that contradict your image, not to destroy your goodness, but to make it real. To anchor it in truth, not illusion. History shows us that the most horrifying acts are rarely done by monsters. They are done by people convinced they are right. People who believe they serve justice, truth, or God. Moral absolutism blinds them to their own capacity for harm. Inquisitions were not led by the wicked. They were led by the righteous. Purges were justified not by hatred, but by purity. Genocides were framed as acts of protection, not destruction. These horrors did not rise from chaos, but from order without self-awareness. Carl Jung saw this clearly. He wrote that the greatest danger lies in the assumption of moral superiority. When a person or system believes it alone holds the truth, it becomes capable of any cruelty in the name of virtue. The shadow becomes sanctified. Totalitarian regimes flourish where the shadow is denied. They do not tolerate ambiguity. They do not question themselves. They paint the world in black and white. And in doing so, they erase the human soul. They replace conscience with ideology. Even in democratic societies, moral absolutism persists. Cancel culture, ideological extremism, dehumanizing rhetoric. These are not signs of strength. They are symptoms of shadow. The refusal to see oneself in the one you condemn. The danger is not in taking a stand. The danger is in believing you are incapable of the thing you oppose. Jung warned that the shadow you do not face becomes the evil you project. And the moment you say, "I could never," is the moment you stop being honest. True morality requires humility. The humility to know that you are not above darkness. That given the right pain, the right fear, the right pressure, you too could fall. And that truth does not weaken your character. It saves it. Some of the most harmful acts in human history have been committed not in hatred, but in the name of love. Not in evil, but in the name of virtue. When goodness becomes armor for the ego, it no longer protects others. It begins to wound them. Carl Jung understood that the shadow does not disappear when you act moral. It simply adapts. It puts on your language. It speaks your ideals. It marches under your cause. But its energy is no longer guided by conscience. It is driven by denial. You might humiliate someone in the name of truth. You might silence them in the name of justice. You might dehumanize them in the name of progress, and still feel like you are doing the right thing. Because your inner shadow is not being questioned. The more convinced you are that you stand on the side of good, the less likely you are to see your own darkness. And that blindness gives your actions a dangerous confidence. You stop listening. You stop feeling. You stop pausing to wonder if harm has entered your voice. This is how virtue turns into violence. Quietly, incrementally, justified by principle, disguised as service. And it often begins with one thought: I am not like them. That thought divides you from your shadow. And once divided, you act as if immune. But no one is immune. The line between light and shadow does not run between people. It runs through each heart. And only by acknowledging that line do you gain the power to choose differently, not from superiority, but from humility. To live ethically is not to feel righteous. It is to stay honest, especially when your actions feel pure, because that is when the shadow is most likely to be hiding, beneath conviction, beneath mission, beneath the face of the good person who has not looked inward. There is perhaps no greater danger than the denial of darkness within sacred institutions. When religions, ideologies, or governments place themselves above moral questioning, they project their shadow onto the very people they are meant to serve. They become blind to the damage they cause. The Church, for example, has long been a force of moral authority. But throughout history, many religious institutions have denied their own shadow. They preached love while condemning and controlling. They promised salvation while perpetrating violence. And in doing so, they externalized the evil they failed to acknowledge within. Carl Jung believed that institutions, like individuals, are shaped by their collective shadow. When a group believes it holds the ultimate truth, it no longer questions itself. It becomes rigid, authoritarian, and capable of unspeakable harm in the name of purity. The shadow hides behind good intentions. This is the moral danger of dogma. When belief becomes unquestionable, it denies the complexity of the human experience. It claims perfection while suppressing the contradictions that make us whole. And as these contradictions are buried, the institution becomes less human and more oppressive. Jung saw that this was not just true for religions, but for any collective structure that refuses to acknowledge its own darkness. Political ideologies, national identities, and cultural movements all run the risk of becoming blind to their own shadow. When moral certainty replaces self-awareness, history repeats itself. We see this today in the way some movements claim moral superiority while casting out their enemies as evil. They define themselves by who they oppose, not by what they embody. And in doing so, they externalize the shadow, refusing to look at their own darkness. True healing in any institution, Jung said, requires the integration of its shadow. Institutions must be willing to face the parts of themselves they hide. They must be willing to question their own power, their own history, their own capacity for harm. Only then can they transform into what they claim to be. Carl Jung warned that what we fail to confront in ourselves, we inevitably project onto the world. This projection is not just personal, it becomes collective. It shapes how entire groups define themselves and how they treat those they label as other. Religious institutions often project evil onto those outside their belief systems. The non-believer becomes the sinner. The critic becomes the enemy. The different becomes the threat. In truth, these are reflections of the shadow the group has refused to integrate. Political ideologies do the same. The opposition is no longer seen as a different viewpoint. It is seen as a moral failure, a symbol of everything that must be destroyed. In this way, projection fuels polarization. It justifies dehumanization in the name of justice. The more certain a movement becomes of its own righteousness, the more it needs a villain. Because the shadow has not disappeared. It has only been projected onto races, classes, political parties, or foreign nations. The pattern is always the same. This projection can become intoxicating. It gives people a sense of identity, a cause to believe in, a common enemy to fight. But it also numbs the conscience. It creates moral blindness. And it turns people into agents of harm without knowing it. Jung believed that true morality requires each person to reclaim their projections. To ask, what am I seeing in the other that I have not faced in myself? This question is not easy, but it is essential. Without it, we continue the ancient cycle of blame and violence. Movements that refuse to look inward become hollow. They may start with noble aims, but if they cannot hold the shadow, they become distorted. The means start to contradict the message, and soon, what was meant to heal begins to harm. Every culture creates heroes and villains. But Carl Jung warned that when a culture splits the world too sharply into good and evil, it loses touch with reality. It begins to worship false saints and deny the very wounds festering beneath its surface. Cultural splitting is the unconscious habit of idealizing certain identities while condemning others. The favored group is seen as virtuous, enlightened, progressive. The unfavored group is labeled backward, corrupt, or dangerous. But this division does not reflect truth. It reflects shadow. The idealized group becomes blind to its own failings. It silences critique. It sees itself as above question. And because no human group is without contradiction, the denied darkness leaks out, in arrogance, in hypocrisy, in quiet cruelty hidden behind noble language. Meanwhile, the condemned group becomes a container for everything the dominant group cannot face. All rage, ignorance, violence, and shame are projected onto them. They become scapegoats, mirrors for what society disowns in itself. Jung saw this not as isolated behavior, but as a psychological mechanism embedded in collective consciousness. Societies split when they cannot tolerate their own ambiguity. They would rather maintain an illusion of purity than face the pain of wholeness. This pattern plays out in politics, media, religion, and art. We elevate voices that affirm our identity. We cancel those that reflect our shadow. We cheer when the villain falls, forgetting how much of them still lives inside us. Projection becomes entertainment. But true culture is not built on denial. It is built on integration. It is not afraid of contradiction. It does not silence discomfort. It sees the human being in both the saint and the sinner, and in doing so, it becomes capable of real growth. Not all morality leads to wholeness. Some morality, especially when rigid or externalized, becomes a mask that hides what we cannot face. It no longer guides us toward truth. It begins to push the shadow deeper underground, where it festers in silence. Carl Jung warned that when we adopt moral codes without integrating our emotional life, those codes become tools of repression. You may appear kind, forgiving, and responsible. But inside, there is rage you cannot name, envy you cannot own, fear you cannot admit. The more you cling to your role as a good person, the more you feel ashamed when darker impulses arise. Instead of examining them, you bury them. You smile instead of speaking your truth. You comply instead of confronting. And over time, your soul splits. Repression creates inner conflict. You begin to live two lives. The outer one that wins approval, and the inner one that hides pain. This hidden life does not go away. It becomes the source of your guilt, anxiety, depression, and emotional fatigue. You may begin to punish yourself for feelings you cannot control. You may isolate to protect others from what you believe is unworthy in you. But Jung believed the real danger is not the darkness itself. The real danger is pretending it isn't there. To repress is to lie to your own soul. And your soul always knows. It keeps calling, through dreams, through moods, through unexpected triggers. It wants you to stop performing and start listening, not to justify the shadow, but to understand it. Morality that leads to repression is not morality. It is fear dressed in principle, and fear cannot create integrity. It can only maintain appearances. If you want to be whole, you must stop hiding behind rules and begin facing what those rules were meant to protect. When the shadow is denied, guilt becomes a constant whisper in the soul. Not the guilt of wrongdoing, but the guilt of being divided, of feeling something you are not supposed to feel, of knowing that what you show is not all that you are. Carl Jung understood guilt not just as a moral response, but as a psychic signal, a sign that the self has been split. One part tries to live according to ideals, the other holds the unlived truth. And the more these parts drift apart, the heavier the guilt becomes. You may begin to feel guilty for being angry, even when anger is justified. You may feel guilt for setting boundaries, for feeling pleasure, for saying no. This is not conscience. This is the symptom of a divided self, where one part condemns the other. Self-splitting creates an inner war. One voice says you must be better. The other cries out just to be seen. You try to silence it through discipline, achievement, or spiritual practice. But it does not disappear. It waits. And it suffers in the dark. This guilt is corrosive. It wears away at your confidence. It makes you question your worth. You begin to live in quiet fear that one day, someone will see the truth. Not that you are bad, but that you are not the version of yourself you pretend to be. Jung believed healing begins when we stop punishing the shadow and begin listening to it, not obeying it, not indulging it, but honoring its voice as part of the whole. Because guilt fades not through denial, but through compassionate integration. To carry guilt without becoming it, to see your darkness without collapsing into shame, is the essence of inner strength. It is not the avoidance of shadow that makes us moral. It is the willingness to face it and still choose to love. Carl Jung once wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." He did not mean we must become evil to be whole. He meant that goodness without contact with darkness is fragile. It cannot withstand reality. You do not become a better person by avoiding your shadow. You become weaker, more easily offended, more easily manipulated, more easily deceived by your own image. Because without a confrontation with evil, your virtue remains untested. To ignore the evil within is to leave it untouched, unmanaged, untransformed. It continues to operate beneath the surface, quietly shaping your decisions, your emotions, your relationships. Not because you are bad, but because you are unconscious. Jung believed that true goodness is forged in struggle. Not in denial, not in self-erasure, but in the courageous effort to face your capacity for cruelty, deceit, manipulation, and still choose differently. Not out of fear, but out of awakened conscience. The world does not need more perfection. It needs more people who have met their shadow and come back humbled. People who know what they are capable of and therefore walk more gently, judge more slowly, love more honestly. This is the moral work of shadow integration. It is not the rejection of darkness, nor the glorification of it. It is the acknowledgement of your whole self, the conscious holding of opposites, the refusal to exile your pain, your fear, your imperfection. To walk toward your shadow is not to become lost in it. It is to reclaim what was abandoned, to offer light to the places you have feared to enter. And in doing so, to discover that moral strength does not come from purity, but from depth. Carl Jung believed that shadow work is not a journey into darkness, but a return to responsibility. The moment you stop blaming others for your inner division is the moment your wholeness begins. You are no longer a victim of unconscious forces. You are a participant in your own evolution. Responsibility does not mean self-blame. It means self-awareness. It means seeing the patterns you carry, the traits you hide, the harm you do without meaning to. It means facing these truths not with shame, but with courage. Not to punish yourself, but to free yourself. This is where moral maturity begins. Not in the performance of goodness, but in the quiet act of taking ownership. You admit that the cruelty you hate in the world exists in you. You admit that the judgments you cast reflect something you have not resolved. The ego resists this responsibility. It prefers to see the problem outside. It wants to be the hero or the victim, never the participant. But Jung taught that inner peace comes not from escape, but from honest confrontation, from taking back what you have disowned. When you take responsibility for your shadow, you stop projecting it onto the people you love. You stop blaming your partner, your parents, your enemies, your society for feelings you have never understood. You begin to reclaim your power by owning your pain. This is the beginning of real change, not through force, not through shame, but through the sacred act of saying, "This is mine. This fear is mine. This anger is mine. This silence is mine, and I will no longer make others carry what I refuse to hold. Responsibility, in Jung's view, is not a burden. It is liberation, because what you claim, you can transform. And what you transform, you no longer fear. And what you no longer fear, no longer controls you. Carl Jung believed that one of the most important steps in shadow work is to admit your own capacity to harm. Not just in theory, but in lived reality. You must come face to face with the part of you that is capable of deception, cruelty, manipulation, and destruction. This is not an invitation to indulge the shadow. It is an invitation to know it, to name what you have hidden, to meet the part of you that lashes out when hurt, that distances when afraid, that judges when vulnerable. These are not mistakes. They are clues. Until you recognize that this capacity lives in you, you will always see it only in others. You will live in a world full of enemies and offenders, and you will never realize how much of your fear is a projection of what you have not yet owned. To face your own destructive potential is to reclaim power, because what remains unconscious controls you. But what is made conscious can be held with maturity. You can learn how to respond instead of react, how to choose integrity over impulse. Many people fear this confrontation because they think it makes them bad. But Jung taught that morality requires exactly this honesty. True virtue is not the absence of darkness. It is the conscious choice to carry it with care. When you admit your shadow, your relationships begin to change. You become less defensive, less accusatory. You stop needing others to be perfect, because you have accepted your own imperfection. And in that space, real compassion is born. You do not become whole by pretending you cannot hurt. You become whole by holding that capacity with responsibility. You watch it. You speak to it. You learn from it. And over time, the part that could harm becomes the part that protects. To hold the shadow is to live with the awareness that you carry both light and dark within you. It is to look at yourself honestly, without flinching, without judgment, and without collapsing into self-loathing. Carl Jung believed that true moral strength comes not from denying our darkness, but from integrating it with compassion and responsibility. Shame is often the ego's first defense when we meet our shadow. We believe that to acknowledge our flaws, our anger, our hidden desires, is to be bad. But Jung taught that this is a trap. Shame keeps you stuck in the old story. It tells you that you must be perfect to be loved, to be worthy. But this is not true. True integration does not mean erasing the shadow or pretending it is not there. It means accepting that it is a part of you. It means holding your anger without acting on it, your envy without allowing it to control you, your fear without letting it dominate your life. The shadow does not disappear when you accept it. It becomes part of your wholeness. It is no longer an enemy. It becomes a teacher. It shows you where you are most vulnerable, where you still fear, where you still lack compassion. And it asks you to grow. When you can hold the shadow without shame, you stop projecting it onto others. You stop blaming others for what you have yet to claim in yourself. You begin to understand that everyone carries a shadow. No one is perfect. And it is through this shared humanity that true connection is made. Jung understood that integration was not an easy task, but it was the only path to freedom. To hold the shadow is to stand in your truth. It is to acknowledge your darkness without letting it control your actions. It is to choose to live with full awareness of who you are, the good, the bad, and everything in between. Carl Jung believed that the moment we begin to face what we project, we begin to reclaim our power. Projection gives away our energy. It forces us to see ourselves through others, rather than through our own eyes. But when we take back what we have projected, we stop living in reaction. Facing projection is not easy. It means admitting that the person you despise or the situation you avoid carries a reflection of your own shadow. It means recognizing that the parts of others that anger you, embarrass you, or disgust you are often parts of yourself that you cannot face. When we project, we are unaware. We see the world as it appears to us, but not as it really is. Projection distorts our view of others. It makes them the enemy, the villain, the reason for our discomfort. But when we stop projecting, we begin to see things clearly. We start to look inward instead of outward. Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Projection keeps us blind. It keeps us trapped in patterns we cannot see. But when we take responsibility for what we have projected, we stop blaming and start growing. This is where true moral strength lies, not in being perfect, but in facing what you refuse to see. When you face your projections, you stop living in unconscious opposition to the world. You begin to live in harmony with yourself. You begin to understand that what you despise in others is a mirror of what you have yet to accept in yourself. The power of facing what we project is the power to heal. When we stop externalizing our pain, we can heal it. When we stop blaming others for our discomfort, we can address the true cause within ourselves. This is where growth begins, not in avoiding, but in embracing. Embracing wholeness is not a destination, it is a journey. It is the willingness to stand in the fullness of your humanity, to hold the light and the dark, to accept not only your virtues but also your flaws. Carl Jung taught that true healing comes from the integration of all parts of the self, not from the eradication of the unwanted. We are not born whole. We are born fragmented, shaped by society, by our family, by our own experiences. But wholeness is our birthright. It is our potential. To be whole is to stop fighting the parts of ourselves we wish didn't exist. To stop rejecting what we think is unworthy. When you embrace wholeness, you stop seeking perfection. You stop striving for an ideal that doesn't exist. You stop pretending. And in that space of authenticity, you begin to feel a peace that cannot be disturbed by external forces, because it comes from within. Wholeness requires us to stop seeing ourselves as good or bad. It requires us to understand that we are a mixture of both. It is the surrender to imperfection that brings freedom. The acknowledgement that we are not defined by our mistakes, but by our ability to learn from them. As you begin to embrace your shadow, you realize that it was never your enemy. It was your teacher. It was the key to understanding your strengths, your limits, your desires, your fears. By facing it, you free yourself from the unconscious patterns that have shaped your life. Jung believed that the ultimate goal was not to become perfect, but to become whole. Whole in our understanding of ourselves. Whole in our relationship to the world. Whole in our ability to accept what we once denied. And in that wholeness, we find the true power to live a life of integrity. Carl Jung's work reminds us that life is not about becoming flawless. It is about becoming whole. The shadow is not a burden to bear, but a teacher to listen to. It reveals what we fear, what we desire, and where we still need growth. By embracing it, we stop living in unconscious reaction and start living in conscious responsibility. It is not evil, but unintegrated parts of ourselves that have yet to be embraced. The shadow, when recognized and integrated, leads us to the deepest truths about who we are. What you project onto others is not their problem. It is yours. The moment you take responsibility for your projections, you free yourself. The moment you embrace the parts of yourself you once feared, you become whole. But the more we integrate, the more whole we become. This is the true meaning of personal power. Not control over others, but control over the self. Not the power to condemn, but the power to understand and accept. Jung teaches us that wholeness is not a place of perfection, but a state of acceptance. What am I projecting onto others that I need to take responsibility for? It is a lifelong journey. But as Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that starts with facing your shadow and embracing the totality of your being. And how can I begin to embrace my shadow to live a life of true wholeness? It is the ability to stand in the contradictions within us and still choose love, compassion, and integrity. It is the courage to face the darkness in others and see it within yourself. The more we project, the more we divide ourselves from others and from ourselves. So as you move forward, ask yourself, what am I still rejecting within myself? Remember, the path to healing and integration is not easy.